The hidden struggle. The Crestwood Hotel looked like any other mid-range chain on the outside. Polished glass doors, a red carpet leading to the lobby, and a tired doorman who smiled just enough to keep up appearances. But behind the bright lights of the reception desk and the polite greetings at the concierge, there was a different story unfolding. The kind of story few guests ever noticed. The kind of story hidden in the corners of back rooms, laundry bins, and quiet corridors where workers moved like shadows. And it was into these shadows that Lucas Remington had stepped. To the world, Lucas was the young and mysterious CEO of the Crestwood Hotel Group, a man whose empire stretched across several states and whose name commanded respect in boardrooms filled with wealthy investors. He had built the company almost from scratch after inheriting nothing but debts from his late father. By the age of 36, Lucas had turned the hotel chain into a recognizable brand. Yet wealth and recognition had never blinded him to the whispers he heard about his own business. Rumors of low wages, exhausted staff, and managers who treated employees like disposable tools. He could have ignored those whispers like many CEOs did. He could have focused on balance sheets, quarterly growth, and media interviews that painted him as the genius entrepreneur. But Lucas had a habit of listening too closely to the stories most people overlooked. And so, instead of sending consultants or managers to inspect the hotel, he chose to go undercover himself. No cameras, no publicity stunt, no crew following him around for a corporate show. Just a fake name, a plain gray uniform, and a tool belt slung around his waist. For the last 2 weeks, he had scrubbed clogged drains, tightened squeaky door hinges, and carried buckets of paint up stairwells. Nobody suspected that the quiet man with calloused hands was the CEO himself. That night, Lucas was making his way down the east wing of the hotel, checking a maintenance request for a broken faucet. The hall smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals and carpet shampoo, the kind of manufactured cleanliness that never quite hid the age of the building. His boots creaked softly against the floor as he walked, toolbox in hand. When he reached room 103, the door was slightly ajar, and the sound of running water drifted into the hallway. He frowned, knocking lightly before pushing it open. The sight that met him rooted him to the floor. Inside, a woman stood over the bathroom sink, her sleeves rolled up, her hands red from scrubbing tiny clothes against the porcelain basin. A pair of miniature jeans and a little t-shirt clung to the sides of the sink, foamy water dripping down into the drain. A cheap bar of soap sat on the counter, worn down to a sliver. She worked quickly, almost frantically, as though time itself were an enemy. Beside her, on a threadbare towel, a few other small clothes were already washed and wrung out, waiting to dry. Lucas watched in silence, taking in every detail. Her back was slightly bent, her dark hair pulled into a loose bun, strands falling into her face. The flickering light above the mirror cast shadows across her tired eyes. She hadn't noticed him yet. It was only when the door creaked wider that she turned, startled. Her eyes widened in panic. "Oh my God," she whispered, quickly dropping the clothes back into the sink. "Please, I'm sorry. I swear I wasn't stealing anything. I'm not using hotel supplies. It's just..." Her voice shook and she pressed her wet hands against her apron as though trying to erase the evidence. "I didn't have quarters for the laundromat and my son. He needs clean clothes for school tomorrow. I'll clean everything up. Please don't tell the manager. I can't lose this job." Lucas said nothing for a long moment. From her perspective, he was just another maintenance worker who had stumbled upon her mistake. His gray shirt and tool belt made him look like every other repairman who came and went from the hotel rooms. She didn't know she was speaking to the very man who owned the place. Her hands trembled as she reached for the tiny jeans again, trying to resume scrubbing, but her strength seemed to falter. Her knuckles were raw, her skin cracked from harsh soap and overwork. Lucas could see how desperately she wanted to appear composed, but her voice betrayed her. I didn't know what else to do," she said, her eyes darting back and forth like a trapped bird. "Please don't report me. I can't afford to lose this. My boy, he depends on me." Lucas finally stepped forward, his voice low but calm. "Hey, it's okay. I'm not going to report you." She froze, staring at him as though trying to judge whether he meant it. For a second, relief flickered across her face, but it was quickly replaced by suspicion. Life had clearly taught her not to trust easily. She nodded once, then bent back to the sink, scrubbing again in silence as if proving she was still working. Lucas leaned against the doorframe, studying her. He had seen staff tired before, but this woman's exhaustion was different. It was bone deep, carved into her posture and movements. Every stroke of her hand against the fabric carried the weight of survival. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. She hesitated, her shoulders stiffening. "Emma," she murmured. Then almost defiantly she added, "Emma Carter." "And your son?" Her eyes softened instantly, though tears threatened to spill. "Ethan. He's 6. There was a silence between them, filled only by the steady drip of the faucet. Lucas wanted to say more, to tell her he understood, but he knew revealing his identity now would overwhelm her. So he simply nodded, leaving her to finish her task. But as he walked away down the hallway, something in his chest tightened. He had come undercover to see the truth of his business. Tonight, the truth had stared him in the face, tired eyes, trembling hands, and a mother's quiet fight to preserve her son's dignity. Lucas didn't sleep that night. The image of Emma scrubbing her boy's clothes in that sink replayed in his mind again and again. He thought about the hundreds of employees across his hotels, each with their own silent struggles, hidden beneath polite smiles and forced greetings. He thought about his own mother, who had worked herself to the bone cleaning houses after his father's death, never complaining, never asking for help. Emma's face carried the same quiet resilience. For the first time in years, Lucas felt the walls around his carefully constructed life crack. This wasn't just about profits, losses, or corporate growth. This was about humanity. And Emma Carter had just reminded him of the one thing money could never buy, the unbreakable strength of a mother's love. The weight of survival. Emma Carter had always known that life was going to be hard, but she never imagined it would be this relentless. She had grown up in a small town where dreams were supposed to sprout from the simplest of beginnings, summer fairs, church on Sundays, and the belief that if you worked hard enough, the world would eventually reward you. Yet by the time she was 24, life had stripped away most of those illusions. When her husband walked out without so much as a goodbye, leaving her with a toddler on her hip and bills piling like storm clouds, Emma's world collapsed in silence. She didn't cry then. She couldn't afford to. Instead, she rolled up her sleeves and began a new life made of endless sacrifices. Her days followed a rhythm that would have broken most people. She woke before dawn, making sure Ethan's tiny backpack was packed with whatever snacks she could afford. Sometimes it was half a sandwich wrapped in paper, sometimes just an apple she had bought from the discount bin at the grocery store. She whispered encouragements to him even when her own body ached from exhaustion, walking him to school before heading to her first shift at the hotel. By mid-morning, she was scrubbing bathrooms, changing sheets, hauling heavy laundry carts down endless hallways. Her second shift at the front desk was no less demanding. She smiled at guests who barely looked her way, her lips stretching into politeness even when her heart was heavy with fatigue. But none of these hardships compared to the moments when Ethan's innocent questions pierced through her defenses. "Mommy, why can't I have shoes like the other kids?" he once asked, staring at his scuffed sneakers with holes at the toes. Emma had swallowed the lump in her throat, crouched down, and told him, "Because your shoes are special. They've walked you through more adventures than anyone else's." She then spent the night sewing patches into the soles, her fingers raw, her eyes red, determined that Ethan would never feel ashamed. Lucas, still undercover, watched this quiet fight from a distance. At first, he told himself he was simply observing as part of his assignment, but something about Emma unsettled him. She wasn't just an employee struggling to make ends meet. She was the embodiment of resilience. He noticed the way she tucked strands of hair behind her ears when she was nervous, the way her eyes lit up only when she spoke of her son, and the way she carried herself with dignity even when life had stripped her of everything else. One evening, Lucas stayed late repairing a leaky pipe in the hotel's laundry room. When he left, he saw Emma in the break room with Ethan, who had been waiting quietly in a corner chair. The boy's legs swung back and forth as he hummed a tune to himself, clutching a worn-out stuffed bear. Emma slid a sandwich across the table to him, but Lucas saw her push away her own hunger, pretending she had already eaten. Ethan didn't notice, Children rarely do when they're loved that fiercely, but Lucas did. He felt an ache he hadn't expected, a reminder of his own mother who had often skipped meals so he could have enough. The next day, Emma faced another test. She returned to her room after her shift to find Ethan's only decent shirt stained from spilled juice at school. The laundromat was out of reach. Her paycheck was days away. So she did what she had to. She filled the sink, scrubbed, and prayed it would be dry by morning. That was the night Lucas had walked in on her. Since that encounter, Lucas found himself wrestling with emotions he hadn't felt in years. He had built a fortress around himself, protecting his heart from vulnerability. Business was easier than empathy. Numbers never cried in the middle of the night. Yet Emma's struggle chipped away at that fortress brick by brick. He began leaving subtle signs of help. When Emma went to collect her cleaning cart, she would find extra towels folded neatly at the bottom. When she clocked out for the night, a warm meal from the kitchen would somehow be waiting in the staff lounge, her name scribbled on the lid. She never knew where these small mercies came from, but she accepted them with quiet gratitude, tucking them into the folds of her survival. Despite these gestures, Emma carried the weight of her battles silently. At night, when Ethan was asleep, she sat by the window of their small room, staring at the city lights, whispering promises into the darkness. "I'll make it better for you, Ethan. I swear." She often cried softly then, the kind of tears that didn't demand attention, but spoke of a soul carrying more than it should. The quiet observations. The following days settled into a rhythm that seemed ordinary to everyone else, but carried hidden meaning for Lucas Remington. To the staff, he was still just Luke, the quiet maintenance man with steady hands and a calm demeanor who fixed broken faucets, replaced light bulbs, and patched walls without complaint. But behind the unassuming uniform, Lucas's eyes were sharper than ever, observing everything in silence. He moved through the corridors not only with his tools but with questions weighing on his mind. Questions about the people who made the hotel function. Questions about the choices he had made as a leader. Questions about whether his success had come at the cost of unseen lives like Emma's. Emma Carter continued her daily battle, balancing exhaustion with dignity. Lucas began to notice the patterns of her struggle more clearly now. He saw the way she stayed behind after shifts, organizing carts so the next worker would have less trouble. He saw her checking the lobby clock too often, always calculating whether she could leave in time to pick up Ethan from the neighbor who watched him. And he saw the way her shoulders sagged each time she faced the condescending remarks of the assistant manager, a man who loved barking orders but rarely lifted a finger himself. Lucas also began to witness small moments of beauty within Emma's struggle, moments that revealed the kind of resilience money couldn't measure. One evening as he passed by the staff lounge, he heard quiet laughter. He stopped at the door and peeked in. Emma was sitting with Ethan at the table, a pile of napkins in front of them. She had folded each napkin into the shape of a bird, and Ethan's giggles filled the room as she pretended to make them fly. The boy clapped his hands with delight, his tired eyes bright with joy. In that moment, Emma wasn't a housekeeper scraping their rough life. She was a mother transforming scraps of paper into magic, turning hardship into happiness with nothing more than imagination and love. The sight pulled at something deep within Lucas. It reminded him of nights long ago when his own mother had done the same with him. She had created worlds out of nothing, stories out of shadows, teaching him that love was greater than poverty. And now, decades later, he was watching that same spirit alive in Emma. Lucas began to help in ways that went unnoticed. He quietly repaired the laundry machine in the basement that had been out of order for weeks, making sure it worked just enough that Emma could wash Ethan's clothes properly if she ever dared. He arranged with the cafeteria staff to have an extra portion of food accidentally left aside at the end of the night, knowing Emma would find it. He even slipped into the storage room one evening and placed a box of fresh supplies, soap, shampoo, towels, into Emma's cleaning cart, disguising it as routine stock. Emma noticed, of course, but she didn't know the source. She only knew that small mercies seemed to appear in her path, as though someone unseen was softening her burden. For a woman who had learned to expect nothing from the world, these little miracles felt both bewildering and humbling. She accepted them with quiet gratitude, whispering prayers of thanks in the privacy of her room while Ethan slept. But even with these quiet acts of kindness, the weight of her life did not disappear. Lucas could see it in the lines beneath her eyes, in the way her body moved slower each day. The management at this branch was merciless, demanding more shifts with fewer breaks, cutting corners while boasting about efficiency. Staff were stretched thin and Emma bore the heaviest load. Lucas began to see the pattern clearly. Corporate policies had been twisted at the local level, turning his vision of hospitality into exploitation. One afternoon, as Lucas repaired a door hinge in a guest hallway, he overheard Emma speaking softly to Ethan. She had brought him along because her babysitter had canceled. The boy was perched on a chair, swinging his legs as Emma folded sheets. "Mom," Ethan said, "why do you always look tired?" Emma froze for a moment before kneeling in front of him. Her voice was gentle, steady, even though Lucas could see the flicker of pain cross her face. "Because I work hard so you can have a better life, Ethan. One day you'll understand. But don't worry about me. Worry about your dreams, okay?" Lucas felt a lump rise in his throat. It wasn't just her exhaustion that struck him. It was her determination to shield her child from the full weight of reality. She bore the brunt of the storm so her son could still believe in sunshine. That kind of strength, Lucas realized, was rarer than any fortune. As the days passed, Lucas became more restless. He had come undercover to gather facts, to confirm suspicions about how his hotels were run. But Emma's presence made it personal. She was no longer just an example of an overworked employee. She was a mirror, forcing him to confront the gap between his ideals and the reality his company had created. The quiet observations he gathered weren't just about Emma. They were about the soul of every worker he had overlooked in the pursuit of expansion. One evening, when Emma left her shift and walked hand in hand with Ethan down the dimly lit street, Lucas followed at a distance. He watched her stop at a corner store, hesitating at the doorway, counting the few bills in her hand before turning back without buying anything. He saw the way she held Ethan's hand tighter, whispering something that made him smile despite the hunger in his eyes. Lucas stood in the shadows, his chest heavy with guilt and admiration. That night, as he lay on the thin mattress of his own modest hotel room, Lucas realized something profound. He had gone undercover to see how his hotels operated, but instead, he had discovered how his heart had stopped listening years ago. And now, because of Emma Carter, it was awake again. Breaking point. The air in the Crestwood Hotel seemed heavier that morning, though to most guests it was nothing more than another day of polished smiles and routine greetings. For Emma Carter, however, every step she took down the hallway felt like she was dragging chains. The night before, Ethan had coughed himself awake 3 times, feverish and restless, and Emma had sat by his side with a cool cloth against his forehead until dawn. By the time she reported for her shift, her body ached and her eyelids burned with fatigue, yet she pushed forward. That was what mothers did. They carried on, even when their own strength was gone. But fate had its own cruelty. As Emma pushed her cleaning cart into one of the guest rooms, the assistant manager, Richard Lane, appeared suddenly in the doorway. His voice, sharp and accusatory, cut through the air like a blade. "Emma Carter," he barked, his eyes narrowing as they fell on the towels stacked in her cart. "I've had complaints. Guests have reported missing supplies, and I've been keeping an eye on the storage room inventory. And what do I find? Towels and soaps disappearing more than they should. Care to explain?" Emma tried one last time, her voice breaking under the weight of desperation. "Please, Mr. Lane, I beg you, don't take my job. My son, he needs me to work. I swear to you, I've done nothing wrong." Richard sneered. "Begging won't save you, Emma. You're one step away from being thrown out. And if you think anyone here will stand up for you, you're mistaken." At that moment, a small voice cut through the tense silence. "Leave my mom alone." All heads turned to see Ethan standing at the end of the hallway, his small figure framed by the morning light filtering in from a side window. He had come looking for her, unable to wait in their room any longer. His fists were clenched, his chin lifted in defiance far larger than his tiny body. He rushed to Emma's side and clung to her leg, glaring up at the towering assistant manager. "She's not a thief. She's my hero." The corridor fell silent. Even Richard faltered for a moment, taken aback by the boy's words. Emma broke then, sinking to her knees, holding Ethan against her as tears finally streamed down her face. Her whole body shook with the release of grief, humiliation, and exhaustion. Ethan pressed his small hands to her cheeks, whispering through his own tears, "Don't cry, Mom. You always tell me heroes don't give up. You're my hero." The onlookers shifted uncomfortably, some looking away, unable to bear the raw humanity of the scene. Lucas, still hidden, felt his throat tighten and his chest ache. In that moment, he no longer saw Emma as just an employee. She was the embodiment of every silent worker whose voice had been stifled by fear, whose dignity had been crushed by careless authority. She was, as her son said, a hero. Lucas wanted nothing more than to reveal himself right then, to crush Richard's arrogance and restore Emma's honor. But he knew the timing wasn't right. A single defense would protect Emma for a D. A systemic change was what she truly needed. Still, he couldn't bear to watch her break. So he stepped forward at last, his voice steady but quiet, directed at Richard. "Back off, Lane," Lucas said, his eyes locking with the assistant managers. "She's telling the truth. I've seen her work. I've seen her honesty. Maybe you should take a closer look at your own practices before accusing others." Richard bristled, taken aback by the maintenance man's audacity. "And who do you think you are to question me?" Lucas held his gaze, unflinching. "Someone who pays attention." The words hung in the air, weighted with meaning only Lucas truly understood. Richard scoffed, muttering under his breath as he stormed away, clearly unnerved by the challenge but unwilling to continue the scene. The crowd dispersed slowly, whispering, and Emma was left kneeling in the hallway, Ethan's arms still tight around her neck. When she finally looked up at Lucas, her tear-stained face carried both gratitude and confusion. She opened her mouth as if to speak but found no words. Lucas simply gave her a small nod, a silent promise that this wasn't the end. Then, without another word, he turned back to his tools and disappeared down the hallway. That night, Emma lay awake with Ethan sleeping peacefully beside her. Her humiliation replayed in her mind again and again, but so did her son's words. "You're my hero." She wondered how long she could keep carrying this fight, how long before her strength gave way. Yet in her heart she knew she couldn't stop. Heroes didn't give up, and for Ethan's sake, neither would she. And down the hall, Lucas sat in his own dim room, staring at the ceiling, his jaw tight with resolve. The time for quiet observation was ending. The breaking point had come. The truth of his company's corruption was laid bare before him, and soon, very soon, the world would know exactly who he was. The reveal. The following week carried an air of unease throughout the hotel. The incident in the hallway had spread in whispers from one staff member to another, told and retold with varying details, but always centered on the same truth. Emma Carter had been accused publicly, humiliated, and nearly dismissed, and yet she had stood her ground with quiet dignity until her son's innocent courage silenced the cruelty. The story traveled not just among the housekeeping staff but also among the kitchen workers, the reception clerks, even the security guards. By the end of the week, Emma had become a quiet symbol, an exhausted mother who had endured shame but refused to let it break her spirit. Lucas, still hidden in plain sight, felt the weight of those whispers pressing on him with every passing day. He could no longer justify the disguise to himself. The purpose of his undercover mission had been to discover the truth about how his hotels functioned, and he had seen it. He had seen enough. He had witnessed corruption, cruelty, and negligence that twisted his vision of hospitality into something cold and merciless. But he had also seen something else: resilience, loyalty, and the quiet heroism of workers like Emma. He knew the time for watching had ended. The time for action had arrived. On a Friday afternoon, the general manager called a mandatory staff meeting in the banquet hall. The employees shuffled in reluctantly, their uniforms wrinkled, their faces weary from long shifts. Some clutched paper cups of weak coffee, others leaned heavily against the walls. At the front of the hall stood Richard Lane, the assistant manager, smug and self-satisfied as always, whispering something into the general manager's ear with the air of a man who thought he owned the world. Emma slipped into the back row quietly, Ethan sitting on her lap because she couldn't find a babysitter that day. She kept her head low, not wanting more attention than she already carried. The meeting began with routine announcements about cost-cutting measures, new guest satisfaction surveys, and stricter rules about supply usage. Richard took the floor at one point, his voice sharp and grating. "We've had theft issues lately," he declared, his eyes scanning the room in a thinly veiled attempt to shame Emma again. "And let me remind you, this company has zero tolerance for dishonesty. Anyone caught will be dismissed immediately. No excuses." Emma's face burned, and she held Ethan closer, but she remained silent. The room was tense, filled with resentment no one dared to voice. It was then that Lucas stepped forward. Dressed still in his gray maintenance shirt, he walked slowly down the aisle until he reached the front of the hall. All eyes followed him, confused. Few paid attention to the maintenance staff normally, but there was something commanding about the way he moved, something in his posture that spoke of authority. He reached the podium and turned to face the crowd. For a moment he said nothing, letting the silence stretch until it grew thick with anticipation. Then his voice, calm but resonant, broke through. "My name isn't Luke," he began, "and I'm not a maintenance worker." A murmur rippled through the room. Richard frowned, his smugness faltering. The general manager blinked in confusion. Emma, in the back, felt her heart race. Lucas continued, his eyes sweeping the room. "My name is Lucas Remington. I am the CEO of the Crestwood Hotel Group." The room erupted, gasps, whispers, shocked exclamations. Some employees looked as though they had seen a ghost. Richard's face went pale, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Emma's arms tightened protectively around Ethan, her mind spinning with disbelief. The quiet man who had fixed light bulbs and unclogged drains, who had defended her in the hallway with nothing more than conviction in his voice. He was the CEO, a new beginning. The banquet hall buzzed with conversations long after Lucas's revelation. The staff dispersed slowly, each person carrying away the memory of the moment when their quiet suffering had been acknowledged by the very man at the top. For many, it felt as though the heavy ceiling that had pressed down on them for years had suddenly lifted, if only a little. Emma Carter, however, remained in her seat at the back, Ethan asleep in her arms, too stunned to move. She could hardly process that the man who had fixed light bulbs and carried tools by her side was not just a colleague, but the CEO, the one man with the power to change everything she thought was unchangeable. Lucas left the hall that night with his heart pounding, his mind ablaze. He had spoken his truth and revealed his identity, but he knew that words alone were not enough. If he truly meant what he had said, then every promise he made had to be followed with action. Otherwise, his speech would be nothing more than another performance. And so before the sun rose the next morning, he began to work, not as an undercover laborer anymore, but as a leader who carried the weight of responsibility. Within days, Lucas assembled a small team of auditors from outside the hotel branch, bypassing the local management entirely. He demanded complete transparency in payroll, work schedules, and staff treatment. The numbers that came back were damning: wages consistently below fair market levels, overtime hours left unpaid, and a pattern of intimidation from supervisors who saw vulnerability as an opportunity to exert control. Lucas's jaw clenched as he read the reports, each line confirming what Emma and countless others had endured. It was worse than he had expected, and yet it fueled his determination. He called another staff meeting, but this time the tone was different. The employees entered cautiously, unsure of what awaited them, but when they saw Lucas at the podium again, their shoulders straightened with a mixture of hope and fear. Emma stood near the back once more, her arms folded, still uncertain if she dared believe. Lucas began without pretense. "You've heard my words," he said, his voice steady. "Now you will see my actions. Effective immediately, every staff member in this branch will receive a wage adjustment to match fair labor standards. Overtime hours will be fully compensated retroactively starting from this year. Health benefits will be reviewed and expanded, and childcare assistance will be introduced for single parents, because no mother or father should have to choose between keeping a job and caring for their child." A ripple of disbelief ran through the crowd. Some gasped, others clapped their hands to their mouths. Emma's heart raced. Childcare assistance? For the first time, she imagined a future where Ethan would be cared for while she worked, where she wouldn't have to beg neighbors or risk leaving him alone. Lucas continued, his gaze unwavering. But reforms on paper mean nothing if they are not lived out every day. That is why leadership will change. Richard Lane is no longer employed here. The general manager will be placed under review. And moving forward, every branch will have employee advocates, people chosen from among you, who will have direct lines to me. I want honesty, and I will accept nothing less. Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then swelling into a thunderous ovation. Tears streamed down the faces of workers who had long forgotten what it felt like to be valued. Emma felt her throat tighten as she clapped with them, but a flicker of doubt remained in her chest. She had lived too many disappointments to surrender completely to hope. The transformation. 6 months had passed since the day Lucas Remington revealed his true identity in the banquet hall, and the Crestwood Hotel no longer felt like the same place. The halls that once echoed with weary footsteps now carried a hum of renewed energy. The staff walked taller, their conversations brighter, their faces less burdened by the fear of being unseen or unheard. Where resignation had once lived, pride now quietly bloomed. For the guests, the change was subtle but undeniable. Smiles were genuine, service was warmer, and the hotel carried an air of dignity that couldn't be bought with marketing or polished brochures. It was the natural result of lives restored to respect. And at the heart of this transformation stood Emma Carter. She had stepped into her new role as assistant manager with hesitation at first, her confidence fragile, her voice trembling the first time she stood in front of her colleagues to give instructions. But week after week, something remarkable happened. She grew. Her compassion, once hidden behind exhaustion, became her greatest strength. She remembered the names of every staff member, not because it was required, but because she wanted to. She asked about their families, listened when they needed to speak, and fought for them when problems arose. She became a bridge between the workers and the corporate structure above, reminding both sides of the humanity that held the company together. Emma's transformation was not without struggle. There were nights she still questioned herself, sitting at her desk after hours with training manuals open, convinced she was in over her head. But then she would think of Ethan, asleep in their now modest but comfortable apartment, and remember why she had said yes in the first place. She wasn't just working for herself anymore. She was building a foundation on which her son's future could stand. And that thought gave her courage she didn't know she had. Ethan, too, was thriving. With childcare support and a more stable home, he was flourishing in school, his teachers amazed at how quickly he picked up reading and numbers. He no longer walked in with worn shoes and worry in his eyes. Instead, he carried stories, laughter, and the unshakable pride of telling anyone who would listen, "My mom is the boss at the hotel." He began to see the world not as a place that constantly took from him, but as a place where possibilities stretched wide. And Emma, every time she watched him smile, felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had given him that gift. Lucas remained involved, though in a quieter way. He visited the branch often, not with the aloofness of a distant executive, but with the humility of someone who understood what it meant to stand alongside his people. Sometimes he would walk through the staff areas without notice, simply observing, smiling at the small changes, a bulletin board filled with staff birthdays, a break room that had been renovated to feel welcoming, an energy that carried hope instead of defeat. And when his eyes landed on Emma, confidently addressing her team, he felt something stir within him. She was no longer the woman he had first found scrubbing clothes in a sink with trembling hands. She was a leader, a force, and an inspiration not just to her colleagues but to him as well. One evening, Lucas asked Emma to join him in his office, now furnished with photographs of staff instead of abstract art. She sat across from him, her posture calm, her expression carrying the strength of a woman who had faced storms and learned to stand tall through them. "Emma," Lucas said, leaning forward, his voice sincere, "when I first came here, I thought I was on a mission to uncover the flaws of my company. But what I found instead was you, and through how I saw the truth of every worker I had overlooked. You've reminded me what leadership is meant to be. It's not about the numbers on a spreadsheet. It's about the lives behind those numbers. And for that, I owe you more than I can ever repay." Emma shook her head, her lips curving into a gentle smile. You don't owe me anything, Lucas. You gave me a chance when no one else would. You believed in me when I didn't even believe in myself. If anything, I should be the one thanking you. He studied her for a long moment before speaking again. Do you know what Ethan told me the last time I saw him in the lobby? Emma raised her brows, curious. What did he say? Lucas's smile deepened. He said, Mr. Lucas, my mom is a hero, and you're a hero too, because you saw it. Emma's eyes filled with tears, her hand instinctively covering her mouth as emotion threatened to overwhelm her. She let out a trembling laugh, shaking her head. That boy has a way of saying things I don't know how to accept. Accept it, Lucas said gently, because it's true. The room fell into a comfortable silence, filled not with the tension of the past, but with the peace of transformation. Outside the window, the city glowed with its endless lights, but inside the office, it felt as though the world had stilled to honor this moment. Months later, Emma stood at the front of the banquet hall once more, this time not as a humiliated worker, but as the assistant manager addressing her staff with pride. Ethan sat in the front row, his chest puffed with excitement as he watched his mother command the room. Lucas stood quietly at the back, arms crossed, his eyes shining with admiration. Emma spoke with a voice that carried strength. This hotel is not just a building, it's a place where people live their stories, guests, yes, but also us. We are the heartbeat of this place, and no matter how hard the world outside may seem, within these walls we will honor each other, respect each other, and carry each other forward, because dignity is not a gift, it's a right, and here it will never be taken away again. The applause that followed was thunderous, echoing through the very bones of the hotel. Ethan jumped to his feet and clapped the loudest, shouting, "That's my mom!" His voice rang clear, carrying pride that was pure and unbreakable. Lucas, standing in the shadows, smiled. He knew that this moment was the true legacy of his decision. Not the profits, not the expansion, not the recognition of investors. It was the transformation of lives, the planting of seeds that would grow far beyond the walls of a single hotel. Emma Carter had become more than an employee, more than an assistant manager. She had become a symbol of what could happen when someone chose to see, to listen, and to act. And as Lucas turned to leave the hall quietly, unnoticed, he felt a quiet peace settle over him. He had come undercover to uncover the truth. What he found instead was something greater, the reminder that true power is not measured in wealth or authority, but in the courage to lift others when they are bowed, to believe in those the world overlooks, and to create hope where despair once lived. Emma had found her transformation. Ethan had found his future, and Lucas had found his purpose again. The story that began with a single mother washing her child's clothes in a sink ended with something far greater, a company reborn, a family restored, and a legacy of compassion that would ripple into generations yet to come.